And this is a presentation and discussion about waste to energy and incineration, and why we feel that these processes are false solutions to the plastic waste disposal problem. Throughout this meeting, we might refer to these processes, waste to energy, incineration, chemical recycling, and even landfill, as destructive disposal. So that's what we intend that term to refer to, and periodically we'll call all of these processes destructive disposal. This event has been provided by the Sierra Club Single-Use Plastics Plus subgroup, which is part of the Sierra Zero Waste Grassroots Network. Members of our group are in the call today, and I'll just mention their names. I'm Janet Stanko, who's coordinating this call, and I'm part of the subgroup. Susan Shore is our chair. Drew Martin is our vice chair. Clint Richmond, Martha Ainsworth, Hoyen Ip, Pam Greenlaw, and Pamela Greenlaw are our subgroup members, and you may even know some of these people. Gary Liss and Roger Diedrich are from our Sierra Club Zero Waste Grassroots Network. Each of these people are subject matter experts about various aspects of the plastic problem and zero waste solutions. The purpose of tonight's presentation is to equip you with arguments to counter the slick narratives of this incineration and plastic industry that says that burning or chemical recycling are answers to the plastic waste disposal problem. One of the key messages that we hope you'll come away with is that plastic source reduction is the real answer to plastic pollution, not the different waste treatment solutions. I do have a couple housekeeping items. This meeting will be recorded, and please put your name and your chapter. I had originally said on your video image, but we aren't showing all the video images. So if you could put it in the chat, we would appreciate it. And also, if you've already come equipped with questions, put your questions in the chat, because that will be the chat will be the main way of sharing your questions. And Martha will monitor the chat, and during our various Q&A sessions, she will share out the questions. We have two speakers tonight. Our first speaker is Kevin Boudris, and he will speak about the problems with these destructive disposal processes and solutions to the plastic waste problem. To give you a little bit of background about Kevin, he's a co-founder and deputy director at Just Zero, a nonprofit organization that works alongside communities, policymakers, organizers, and others to implement just and equitable solutions to our waste crisis. Just Zero prioritizes a holistic approach to zero waste advocacy that utilizes education, policy, and community engagement to work towards shutting down dangerous facilities like incinerators and landfills, while advancing solutions that stop waste before it starts. Prior to Just Zero, Kevin was a senior attorney in the Zero Waste Program at Conservation Law Foundation, and he previously worked at the National Environmental Law Center, where he brought citizen enforcement lawsuits against polluting landfills and incinerators. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kevin. Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks so much, Janet, and thank you all for inviting me to be here with you all tonight, and taking the time out of your busy evenings to talk about what I'm sure many of you agree is an incredibly important topic, especially as we all try to work toward the right solutions to the plastics problem, to the waste crisis, to the wide variety of plastics and waste issues that many of us have recognized in our work in our communities, in your work in your Sierra Club chapters, as significant problems that plague our environment, our day-to-day lives, and the communities in which we live and with whom we partner. As Janet mentioned, my name is Kevin Boudris. I'm Deputy Director of Just Zero. And as she said, I'm going to be talking with you a little bit about the problems, such as they are with incineration, and how we can replace this idea of incineration as part of the answer to our waste and plastics issues with real zero waste solutions moving forward. Before I dive in, sorry, I'm just having problem advancing my slides. There we go. Before I dive in any further, I just want to say a quick word about who we are and what we do at Just Zero. Or for those of you who are not familiar with us, we are a relatively new member-supported 501c3 nonprofit organization. As Janet mentioned, our mission is to work alongside communities, policymakers, scientists, and others to implement just and equitable solutions to the waste crisis. Ultimately, we believe that everyone deserves zero waste solutions with zero climate damaging emissions and zero toxic exposures. As Janet also mentioned, we've taken a holistic approach to this work. We prioritize shutting down dangerous waste facilities like incinerators, but also advance policy solutions to stop waste before it starts. And so today I'm going to be kind of talking about both of those things, moving away from dangerous waste facilities, but importantly, how we all together can implement the right policy solutions that get real zero waste answers in place to stop waste before it starts. And a little later in my presentation, I'm really going to dive in a little bit more on what Just Zero does and hopefully what we can do working alongside your communities and your Sierra Club chapters to really try to work together to get this done in as many places across the country as possible. So my agenda here is kind of two-part, again, focusing on the problem first, how incineration is inherently and unalterably toxic, climate damaging, and unjust. We'll take a short break after that part of the presentation to answer any questions, engage in any discussion that you might have over that problem framing, so to speak. And then I'll move on to discuss more in depth the real zero waste solutions to the waste crisis. So first up, incineration. I said it already. I'm going to say it several times throughout this presentation. Incineration is toxic, climate damaging, and unjust. There are no ways around those three kind of core realities when it comes to burning trash. And before I kind of get into those details a little bit more, I think it's important to start with talking about our trash. We're talking about what happens when we burn our trash. We need to ground this in what is our trash? How much trash are we generating and what's in that trash? As a country, we are producing approximately 300 million tons of waste each year. That's almost 1,800 pounds per person. And in 2018, the country buried in landfills a little bit less than 150 million tons of that waste and burned just under 35 million tons of that waste. And that waste that's being burned is really what we're going to focus on here in this first part of the presentation. And so I think it's useful, and I have this illustrated up on this little pie chart here, the source data for which comes from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. What's in the trash that we're burning? Now, this is an overall picture of waste that's being sent to incinerators across the country. It's not, it doesn't necessarily mean that this is the exact breakdown on what's being sent to any particular incinerator, but it provides an overall picture of what we're burning. And it's important to look at what we're burning because it helps frame why the result is so toxic and so climate damaging. And when we come back to it later, what the real solutions are, what can we do with what's in our waste stream? Because when we look at it, so much of it is paper, plastic, glass, metal. A lot of that is single-use packaging. And then a lot of it is organic waste, food waste. These are things that should not be waste in the first place. So when we talk about alternatives to burning, it's important that we kind of frame it in what can we do to stop this waste before it starts, to avoid it entirely. Because, as I mentioned before, burning waste is toxic. There is no way around that. Every single incinerator in this country is emitting mercury, lead, dioxins, nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, particulate matter, and a host of a host of other toxics. Every single incinerator. And in fact, incinerators are emitting more of these toxics than comparable coal-fired power plants, which have been held up for decades in this country as the apex of toxicity and climate damage, so to speak. And these are incredibly harmful toxics. They cause cancers, they cause organ damage like cardiovascular damage, kidney damage, immune damage. They cause asthma. They cause developmental delays and reproductive harm. Every single one of these toxics is dangerous to human health. And many of them, like mercury, lead, dioxins in particular, have long been recognized by scientists as unsafe at any level. And every single incinerator in the country is emitting these toxics. And again, when we look at what's in our trash, we can start to understand why that's the case and why, despite the myths that may be spread by the waste industry and the incineration industry, and misinformation that they put out there, it's inalterable, because a basic truth when it comes to all of this is toxics in, toxics out. While when you look at this pie chart, it may seem like a lot of what's in our day-to-day waste is rather innocuous. In fact, it's not. Especially the packaging waste that's in there, including the paper, the plastic, and a lot of the metal, contains toxics. Things like heavy metals, PCBs, PFAS, other endocrine disruptors. We cannot wave a magic wand and simply hope that these are going to disappear when they're burned, because they don't. And in fact, beyond the truth, toxics in, toxics out, the actual combustion process, the burning process, generates additional toxics. When we burn things like plastics, organics, tires in particular, that generates dioxins. Chemicals that have been previously described as the most dangerous toxic chemicals known to humankind. When we burn trash, when we burn the toxics in our trash, we end up with toxics. Now, despite that fact, the waste industry loves to lean on the myth that incinerators are somehow safe and that they comply with emissions limits. And I want to spend a little time here kind of breaking down and taking apart this myth, because it's one that we see again and again and again. So it's important, one, when we're talking about this myth, when we're talking about claims by the industry that incinerators comply with emissions limits, what are those limits? Most of those emissions limits are set in permits issued by state and federal agencies under the Federal Clean Air Act. They specify that incinerators can be in compliance with the Clean Air Act as long as they only emit a certain amount of lead or a certain amount of mercury or a certain amount of carbon monoxide. It's important to recognize that most of these limits are set based on what these incinerators, many of them aging facilities, can accomplish based on available technology. Most of these permit limits are not set to be absolutely protective of human health. Again, many of these toxics like lead and mercury dioxins are unsafe at any level, and yet these permits allow these facilities to emit these toxics into nearby neighborhoods, because these permit limits are not focused on health, they're focused on the best these facilities can do, so to speak, which frankly isn't good enough when we're talking about many of these really dangerous chemicals. On top of that, when these incinerators are reporting their compliance or lack thereof with these limits, they are not continuously monitoring for the most hazardous pollutants. Their compliance is reported and monitored largely through things that are called stack tests, which are infrequent tests of the facility under certain operating conditions to basically take a snapshot of what's coming out of the facility at that time. But those stack tests aren't necessarily representative of day-to-day, minute-to-minute operating conditions. And so you don't actually know at any given moment whether or how much lead or mercury or dioxin a particular facility is belching out into nearby neighborhoods. And especially given how many different things are in trash, this kind of snapshot estimate really doesn't capture what may actually be coming out of these facilities at any given moment. It's also important to note that most incinerators in this country, more than half of them, are 30 years old or older. These are aging facilities. They frequently break down. They frequently need maintenance. When incinerators, especially these old ones that are starting up and shutting down frequently, when they're starting up, when they're shutting down, when they're undergoing maintenance, they are exempt from their emissions limits. And this is happening quite frequently in many of these older facilities. So when these incinerator companies say that they're safe and they comply with their emissions limits, well, keep in mind that those emissions limits don't always apply. And those times when they're shutting down and when they're undergoing maintenance is usually when they are the most polluting. And so there's a giant loophole in their claims that they're somehow complying with limits and they're safe. Lastly, I want to note here before moving on that you cannot, when it comes to emissions control equipment in particular, you can't just wave a magic wand and say, oh, the dioxins are gone, the lead is gone, the mercury is gone. It ends up somewhere. If they're capturing it, or capturing some of it for that matter, if they're capturing some of it in their smokestacks, that means it's ending up in their ash. Another big myth that the incinerator industry likes to spread is that that incinerators replace landfills. And that is far from the truth. Incinerators and landfills operate in concert because roughly 25% of the weight of incoming trash is left over after incineration as ash. And that ash contains those toxics, the dioxins, the lead, the mercury, PCBs, PFAS, and it has to be landfilled. And EPA has recognized that all landfills leak. And in so leaking, the landfill leachate, the garbage brew, where liquid has filtered through the landfill and picked up all of these toxics, ends up in groundwater, ends up in surface water. And the leachate that doesn't leak out is captured through a leachate collection network. And in most landfills, that leachate is then either piped or trucked to wastewater treatment facilities. These facilities in the US are, generally speaking, not equipped to remove lead or mercury or dioxins or PFAS. So all of these contaminants that were once in the ash landfill end up at the discharge point from wastewater treatment facilities, our rivers, our lakes, our bays, and oceans. Toxics in, toxics out. Now, on top of being toxic, incineration is always climate damaging. Burning trash generates greenhouse damaging gases. Incinerators, in fact, generate more carbon dioxide, again, than coal-fired power plants. So much of what's in our trash, kind of going back to that pie chart, the plastic, the paper, the organic waste, the yard waste, the food waste, it's carbon rich. It's why it burns. All of that carbon and other climate damaging gases end up in our atmosphere. And it's important in countering the misinformation spread by the industry to note that biogenic, quote, emissions matter. Biogenic emissions are those types of, a lot of what I just mentioned, the paper and the wood and the yard waste and the food waste that's being burned in incinerators. The industry, and frankly also US EPA, likes to discount those emissions by claiming that they're a part of the carbon cycle, the natural carbon cycle. That those emissions would occur as forest matter and yard waste decompose, or as food waste is in a landfill. But that simply isn't the case, especially noting that landfills aren't the proper point of comparison. If that food waste is composted instead of burned or landfilled, it actually acts as a carbon sink and prevents a lot of that carbon from hitting the atmosphere. And despite this reality, the industry likes to claim that incinerators generate renewable energy, which is quite frankly, based on everything I just mentioned, preposterous. On top of that, there's nothing renewable about trash. And the problem is that incinerators, as many of you probably know, actually create a perverse incentive where there's a motivation to generate more trash. There's a feed the beast paradox here, that once you build an incinerator, it has to be fed. It craves the feedstock to burn. And so communities, towns, cities have less of an incentive to reduce trash because they may be in a put or what's called a put or pay contract with an incinerator where they're expected to generate a certain amount of that quote feedstock every year to feed the incinerator. On top of all of that, more than half of the states in this country allow incinerators to claim subsidies that are supposed to be earmarked for truly renewable energy like wind or solar. So on top of the climate damaging gases emitted by these incinerators, they're at the same time competing with actual renewables and making it harder to get those things in place, thus compounding the climate damage that they're already doing. And lastly, in my three-step journey through toxicity, climate damage is an injustice, burning trash is unjust. Nationwide, 79% of incinerators are in environmental justice communities. Those are communities of color, low-income communities, communities of limited English-speaking proficiency. It is especially true of the 20 largest incinerators in this country, which burn a disproportionate amount of waste. 16 of those are in communities of color. And despite the intentional placement of these facilities in overburdened communities that often lack the time and the resources to fight back, another myth spread by the industry is that somehow incinerators are good neighbors, which is ridiculous in light of the fact that study after study have shown that, lo and behold, these communities near these toxic facilities suffer from elevated rates of lead poisoning, asthma, and certain cancers. On top of that, incinerators can create significant cost burdens for host communities, especially as they age and fall into disrepair, at which point the incinerator raises fees, raises tipping costs to make up for the lost revenue as they age and require more investments. It's important to note that when the industry talks about creating jobs in communities, so on and so forth, reuse, recycling, and composting create far more jobs than burning trash, and at far less cost. Ultimately, all of these myths spread by the industry are propped up by the fact that they are asking the wrong question. They're asking what to do with all of this waste after the fact instead of what to do to prevent this waste. The waste crisis is about more than just waste, because we are producing 300 million tons of trash each year. That's a production problem, not a disposal problem. Which leads us to the biggest myth of all spread by the industry, that waste is somehow inevitable and it has to go somewhere. The problem is that somewhere is a real place filled with real people. In fact, 76 million people in this country, almost a quarter of our population, lives within 3 miles of a landfill or an incinerator. And there's just no good choice if we treat waste as inevitable. It props up the industry when they claim that, well, your choices are burning waste or burying waste. Choose which one you would rather do. And it creates this reality where we're debating between these two terrible options instead of prioritizing the things that will help us move away from burning and burying. Because both landfills and incinerators are climate damaging. They're both poisonous, they both leave a toxic legacy, and they're both risky and expensive. These false narratives end up yielding false solutions. One of which, as the industry attempts to evolve and peddle new myths, is what's known as quote unquote advanced recycling or chemical recycling, a new fall solution, a supposedly new fall solution that's being pushed by both the incineration industry and the petrochemical industry. These processes use high heat pyrolysis to melt and boil plastics and other waste into hydrocarbons and toxic chemicals. Just like any other burning process. They are toxic, they are climate damaging, and they are unjust. In fact, in a recent study, and I have the link up here on this page when the slides are distributed later, you can access it. In a recent study that we did of advanced recycling, Just Zero found that of the currently operating and planned advanced recycling facilities in this country, 76% of them are environmental justice communities. Very similar to incinerators. Same old myths, same old false choice between burning one way or burning a new way, same old burdens. The only way we move beyond this false narrative, this untenable false choice, and this myth that waste is inevitable, is to prioritize the real solutions to the plastics crisis and to the waste crisis as a whole, which are zero waste solutions. At that, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment to answer any questions that may have come up for you all on this problem framing portion of the presentation, and then we'll get back into the solutions in a second.
Thank you, Kevin. At this point, we'd like to take just a few minutes to answer any questions from the chat. Martha, do you have some questions from the chat?
Yes, I do. This is a question from someone from Florida. Many Florida municipalities have little interest in anything other than incineration. So how do we thwart these done deals?
It is hard. It is admittedly hard to thwart the done deals. The best, and we'll talk about this in the solutions. The best options as we see it are to, I would say, continually push town officials, city officials, state officials for the real solutions. They need to be jarred outside this complacency that this is a done deal, that this is the only option, that they're stuck sending their waste to an incinerator because you got to do something with it. I mean, that's what we see time and time again when we have these conversations with city officials, town officials, state officials. Waste has got to go somewhere. They need to hear more from you about the real solutions so that they can wrap their head around the fact that waste does not have to be inevitable. That the past few decades of plastic generation and waste generation, particularly in this country, are an anomaly rather than the norm. And if we set the right systems in place, which we'll discuss soon, we don't have to be locked in to this terrible choice.
Okay, here's another question. How can the emissions limits which comply with permits be revised on the state and national levels?
So many of these permits, again, issued to these facilities under the Federal Clean Air Act, come up for renewal every the period can be different for different sets of permits, but every 5 years or 10 years, somewhere in the neighborhood of that periodicity. And that is when permit limits are revisited. So they can't ever be changed in existing permits, but when these permits come up for renewal, they will often go to public comment processes. There are opportunities for people to weigh in to hopefully urge stronger permit limits. And those can be one of the kind of key action opportunities on existing incinerators to try to at least do something to lower the limits. If the incinerator isn't going to shut down, there are opportunities for folks to urge safer and more stringent limits for these facilities.
Okay, there's a question here on how plastics are recycled. The questioner says they understood that very little plastic is actually recycled.
Um, that's true. Very little of our plastic in this country is actually recycled. It's somewhere on the order of 5% of all of our plastics are actually recycled. And frankly, that number is even a little high because that incorporates things like downcycling. Rather than turning a plastic bottle into a new plastic bottle, downcycling is turning a plastic bottle into a park bench or a fleece or a carpet. It's just another stop on the way to an incinerator or a landfill. It's not truly interrupting the production cycle for plastic. It's a problem. This isn't to say that we should all stop putting things in our recycling bins, but especially when it comes to plastic, the frankly outright failures of plastic recycling in this country and across the world over the past decades helps show that the only real answer there is to stop making so much plastic. Because if we're only recycling 5% of it, means the other 95% is ending up in landfills, is ending up in incinerators, and is ending up in our environment. That's failure. Recycling for plastics has failed. And the only way then to keep these plastics out of our environment, out of landfills, out of incinerators, is to stop making so much of the stuff in the first place. I'm going to talk a little bit in the solutions, some of the broader policy initiatives that can help us get there, because it's easy to say that, but we can't just snap our fingers and hope that all the plastics are going to disappear from our lives overnight, because if that were the case, it would have happened already.
Okay,
Yeah, one just-
why don't we
okay.
move on to the second part of Kevin's presentation, which is the solutions, and then we'll have another chance to ask questions after Kevin's presentation before Rogers.
Great. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to quickly advance slide started over again. So allow me a second and I will quickly advance through. Okay, so let's dive in on the real solutions. As I said, this myth that waste is inevitable, that it has to go somewhere, that plastic is inevitable, and we can't pivot away from it, is helping prop up the incineration industry, and is keeping us trapped in this place where it's false solution after false solution after false solution. So the answer is the answers are solutions that prioritize zero waste. People use that term a lot. What does it mean? There is a recognized definition of zero waste from the Zero Waste International Alliance. It is the conservation of all resources by means of responsible production, consumption, reuse, and recovery of products, packaging, and materials without burning and with no discharges to land, water, or air that threaten the environment or human health. That is a fantastic definition. It is also a lot. And so I like to break down, especially when we talk about some of the systemic policy solutions, of what zero waste, especially at the policy level for states and sometimes cities, can look like in practice. What does it look like in practice to work ourselves towards a reality where there is no burning of trash and there are no harmful discharges to land, water, or air? So again, we're going to look at this pie chart, and I'm going to refer to this a bunch in this section of the presentation. Zero waste means stopping waste before it starts. It means looking at this breakdown of what's in our waste and figuring out what are the big picture policy answers that shrink each of these portions of this pie chart. So first, we're looking at significantly reduced waste. Then we're looking at eliminating waste and diverting what can't be reduced or eliminated. Before I go a little further on these policies, I want to be clear up front what zero waste is not, especially in this context where we're talking about primarily looking for real solutions to the plastics problem. Zero waste is not individual choices. Individual choices are important. They can help drive change, but individual choices alone are not going to rid us of all the single-use plastics that are in our environment, that are in our landfills, and that we're burning in incinerators. I try, being in the profession that I am, to make the best individual choices that I can. And yet I end up with single-use plastics and single-use packaging in my life. They only take us so far unless we force the systemic changes that I'm going to talk about shortly. Zero waste is not recycle, recycle, recycle. We just talked about the failures of plastic recycling. We cannot lean on recycling to solve the problem when the real solution, again, is stopping waste before it starts. Source reduction is not the same thing as recycling. Zero waste is not programs that put polluters in control. I'm going to talk about this, especially when I talk about packaging reduction as a solution, but we can't empower the folks, the incinerator companies, the consumer brands, and the packaging manufacturers that are creating these problems in the first place and think that they can lead us to the right answers when they are financially incentivized to keep us trapped in these false narratives that pad their wallets, frankly. Zero waste is not false solutions that I mentioned earlier, like advanced recycling or chemical recycling. It's not zero waste to landfill, which is a buzz phrase that a lot of companies have been using, which essentially means burning trash. It's not a circular economy for plastics, which means burning plastic. And it isn't any false solution that isn't putting waste reduction at the center. That is what this comes down to: waste reduction, source reduction, plastics reduction. So what does zero waste mean in practice? And so the first kind of key systemic policy that I'd like to talk about here is packaging reduction, reuse, and recycling. Packaging reduction, reuse, and recycling laws, sometimes known as extended producer responsibility for packaging laws, can play a really important role in helping shrink this waste pile. The paper, the plastic, the glass, the metal that's in the waste stream that's being burned in this country, a significant amount of that is single-use packaging. It's not all of it, but roughly 30% of everything that we're burning and burying in this country is single-use packaging. A lot of that is plastic. Think of what's filling up the trash bins in our homes. It's the packaging that we don't want, but we end up with after we come back from the grocery store, or that we end up with after placing an order online. The right types of packaging reduction laws that force consumer brands and packaging manufacturers to reduce their packaging and pivot to reuse can make a significant dent in that 30% of our waste stream. But there are kind of a few important notes, do's and don'ts, clarification points when it comes to these types of laws. Because extended producer responsibility for packaging has become a big topic across the country. And frankly, there are states that are not doing a good job of trying to get these programs off the ground. Good packaging reduction programs prioritize reduction and reuse over recycling, over industry-backed solutions. They include mandatory enforceable targets. Again, we need to use these types of laws and programs to require these industries to reduce their packaging, to pivot to reuse, to shrink that 30% of our waste stream that we're burning. And they also provide strong oversight. You're not just letting the industry do what it wants and kind of sitting back and waiting for it to happen. You're making sure that there's change in the industry, that there's change in the way that we do packaging. Don'ts, the bad versions of these laws, simply hand the keys to the industries that created the problem. Empower consumer brands to make their own choices about what they're going to reduce, how they're going to reduce it, what are they going to do in terms of defining recycling. Folks that we work with on this often use the example that kind of empowering the industry in this way is basically the same thing as letting ExxonMobil chart the course to renewable energy in this country. It doesn't make sense. Consumer brands have created our packaging crisis. They need to be required to change their way to do business, not empowered to set their own goals and do things the way they want. To do this right, these bills also need to not carve out loopholes for incineration and advanced recycling. We can't count anything that's burning or exposing plastic to high heat as recycling. It's toxic, it's climate damaging, it's unjust, and it's not source reduction. Source reduction is the key. Programs that empower folks who profit off burning waste or creating waste are a step in the wrong direction. Zero waste also means bottle bills. 10 states in this country have bottle bills. Some of those states have had bottle bills for more than 4 decades. Bottle bills work. It is a smaller portion of our waste stream than the rest of consumer packaging and single-use packaging. And yet, after 4 decades, bottle bills remain one of the best ways to keep beverage containers out of incinerators, out of landfills, to set up better recycling programs, and increasingly to create the right infrastructure and platforms to pivot to reuse, to truly reduce waste, to move away from the single-use products that are filling our landfills and that we're burning in incinerators. We need reusable containers. Bottle bill return and infrastructure programs can do exactly that. The best bottle bills set strong deposits. A 5-cent or a 10-cent deposit, 5-cent deposit increasingly does not cut it in this country. 10, 15-cent deposits, higher deposits that people pay when they purchase a beverage container and get back when they return it can help incentivize waste diversion, keep those containers out of the environment and out of landfills and incinerators. Good bottle bills also include redemption and convenience targets, and as I mentioned before, help us transition to reusable containers. Prioritize, again, source reduction. The best programs to address the plastic crisis and the waste crisis prioritize reducing waste at its source. Another resource up here that folks can access when they get these slides goes through what some of these elements, what makes the best bottle bills and makes them a part of really essential zero waste solutions. Zero waste also means single-use plastic bans. Bans on plastic bags, bans on polystyrene foam, things like that. Again, a smaller portion of the waste stream, but these are an important step. We've seen across the country that towns, cities, states implementing these bans are reducing the amount of single-use plastic, single-use packaging in their communities. Reduce, reuse, recycle is a hierarchy. Banning the unrecyclable products, the things that are not reusable, the toxic products that are inevitably going to end up in an incinerator or a landfill, is a step on the path towards zero waste. These bans build momentum, and ultimately, as with the rest of our waste stream, plastic is a production problem. We can't address plastics by just figuring out what to do with waste containers, with waste bags. We have to start by getting rid of what we don't need in the first place. Moving beyond plastics, just quickly at the end, zero waste means organic waste diversion and composting. It's more than a third of what we're burning in incinerators. Good food waste prevention and recycling laws require food waste generators to avoid waste and manage what remains through donations and composting. This helps divert wasted food to those who need it to the extent it can be rescued, and it helps drive investments in composting programs. These types of programs, these types of systemic policies can make a big difference. Backyard composting is great. I love people doing that. We need the state and citywide laws that require everyone, especially the larger food generators, to have access to and use food waste diversion programs. That more than a third of the waste stream that's being burned should never be there in the first place. It can be diverted, it can be composted. A few quick hits here at the end. Almost 10% of what's being burned is textiles. Zero waste means textiles reuse and recycling. There are programs for this popping up across the country. And importantly, what we increasingly need to do is look upstream at what our textiles are made out of, because lo and behold, a lot of it these days is plastics, and that makes them largely unrecyclable. the more we focus on how our textiles are made through the right accountability and transparency laws, and the more we do to incentivize reuse and recycling of textiles, again, through the right programs and laws, allows us to get this 10% of the waste stream out. And lastly here, zero waste means pay as you throw. Pay as you throw programs exist in towns and cities throughout the US. They're the types of programs where folks pay per unit of waste that they're throwing away. Often they pay for a certain bag, and they have to pay to buy new bags to throw out more trash. These programs have been proven across the country to reduce waste by as much as 40% in as short a span as a year. And when coupled with curbside composting programs, sometimes by more than 60%. These are the simple solutions that are at our fingertips right now that help people make different choices and can make a serious dent in this waste and move us toward the reduction, the elimination, the reuse, that prioritize stopping waste before it starts instead of treating waste as an inevitability. These things together are the solutions to the plastic crisis. They're the solutions to the waste crisis. And lastly, I'll mention here at the end that Just Zero is here to help. You all are already working on this type of stuff in your communities, in your chapters of Sierra Club. We want to work alongside you. If there's anything we can do to help on the education front with resources, with policies, with community engagement, that's what we're here to do. And on this last slide here, this is just a way for you to stay in touch with us. I know these slides will be distributed later. There's a QR code, there's a link here. Sign up for our email list if you're interested. We have a newsletter, we send out resources, we send out updates on what's going on with these types of policy solutions across the country. Stay in touch. And with that, I guess we'll transition back into more questions to the extent folks have them.
Yes, thank you, Kevin. Martha, do you have questions from the chat? We're only taking questions from the chat right now. Later, if there's time, we'll take hand-raised questions, but go ahead, Martha.
Right. So we have two kind of groupings of questions here. Some are on incineration and some are on plastics. And let me go with the plastics first. Can you elaborate a bit more on the topic of the circular economy with respect to plastics?
Yeah. So the circular economy for plastics as a phrase is something that's being pushed by the plastics industry itself. Much like advanced recycling, other supposed solutions to the plastics crisis that make it seem like new technologies can help us recycle plastics better. This is an effort to make us all feel like we can keep on keeping on, that these plastics are okay in our lives because we have the answers for them. When in reality, much like the history of plastics recycling in this country, none of these new supposed advances are going to make plastics safer, given that plastics are loaded with toxics from the get-go, are going to keep plastics out of our environment or out of incinerators or landfills, or going to make any of this sustainable in the long term. The circular economy for plastics is a way to distract us from what we really need, which is fewer plastics to begin with.
Does that apply to mandatory post-consumer recycled content laws?
So,
what is Just Zero's view of that?
Sorry, well, I didn't catch that. Sorry, Martha.
Sorry. Does what you're saying then, does that mean that you don't think that post-consumer recycled content requirements in legislation is worth it?
So we at Just Zero are continuing to explore the value that post-consumer recycled content for plastics can potentially have in legislation. We have concerns, given the fact that plastics recycling has been largely a failure. That even when it works, plastics recycling, even mechanical recycling, kind of what we think of as traditional plastics recycling, still poses toxicity risks, and that plastics are themselves toxic. We have concerns about post-consumer recycled content laws for plastics. That's not necessarily true of post-consumer recycled content requirements for things like paper, metal, glass, things like that. But plastic is a petroleum product. It was never designed to be recyclable, was never intended to be recyclable. And the only way to make plastic is by loading it with the types of things that make it more rigid or more flexible or a certain color. And all of that stuff is inherently toxic. And so, while in the past we've been more supportive of PCR, post-consumer recycled content mandates, we have those concerns, and frankly, especially in bills around packaging or in bottle bills, those types of things, the better incentives, the better programs are the ones that pivot to reuse rather than emphasizing recycling as a way to solve many of these waste and plastics problems, because ultimately reuse is a better path to source reduction than recycling.
We have another question here. How have those in other states managed to get bottle bills passed?
It's a great question, because it's been a while since a new bottle bill has been passed in this country, and even modernizing existing bottle bills has been a slog. I think the most recent state to update its bottle bill was Connecticut, which was a few years ago, when they upgraded from a 5-cent deposit to a 10-cent deposit and expanded the containers that were covered. But it's been more than a decade since a state has passed a new bottle bill. What we are encouraged by is the fact that there are a number of new states that have been increasingly active in trying to pass new bottle bills over the past few years. States like Rhode Island, Illinois, Maryland have really been pushing and building the groundswell for these. We're hopeful that one is going to break through. To the original question of how that gets done, a lot of this comes back to education. A lot of misinformation is constantly spread about bottle bills, especially by the beverage industry. American Beverage Association, Coca-Cola, Pepsi have worked for a long time to try to dismantle and block bottle bills. The more we can all collectively do to talk with our lawmakers about the fact that bottle bills are a proven solution, and for decades have been one of the best answers when it comes to keeping waste out of incinerators and landfills in the states that have them, the more we can do to kind of turn the tide and keep building the momentum. I'm really hoping that one of these states is going to break through in the next year or two, and we start getting more and more states with new bottle bills.
Okay, Martha, I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll move on to Roger's presentation.
Okay, I'm going to go to one on incineration here since I skipped that. Why is it so expensive to use incineration? Why is that so much more expensive?
A lot of it comes down to the equipment. I mean, incinerators are big. I don't want to overstate their complexity, but they're big, complex sets of machines. There's a lot going on at an incinerator, especially when compared to real zero waste diversion opportunities like composting, like reuse, which are a lot cheaper than setting up elaborate machinery to transport and burn waste that we didn't need in the first place. The other thing too with incinerators is, as I mentioned, so many of them are so old. And so these machines are breaking down, and they need constant maintenance, and they need refurbishment if they're going to keep on burning trash. And that adds significantly to the expense of burning waste. especially, and this kind of gets back to the point I made about the myth of incinerators being good neighbors. For all of these costs that go into incineration, they don't create a lot of jobs. It doesn't take that many people to operate an incinerator, but it takes an increasingly complex set of machinery to do it. So that's money going to the folks that are making and operating incinerators rather than money going to, good green jobs like composting, reuse, recycling, bottle collection, et cetera, actually in communities.
Hey,
Thank you.
we are ready to move on to Roger's portion of our presentation. Roger Diedrich, who is a Sierra Club person, will talk about Sierra Club's positions on the various destructive disposal processes. And Roger's background, to just kind of give you a little bit of contextual information, he's been active in waste issues since campaigning for bottle bills and serving as waste chair in the Virginia chapter of Sierra Club in the 1980s. He was a charter member of the board of directors of the Container Recycling Institute, where he served for over 20 years. Roger joined the club's National Waste Committee in about 1990, which then evolved into the National Zero Waste Team, where he remains active today. He chaired the task force that drafted the club's zero waste policy, which was adopted in 2019, and led the preparation of the destructive disposal guidance document that was adopted by the board last year, and that's what he's going to talk about today. Roger is retired from the U.S. Department of Energy and lives with his wife outside of Houston, Texas. So with that, I'll start Roger's presentation. Oh, can you see it?
Okay, all right, thank you. Can you all hear me? Thank you, Janet, for the introduction. And hello to all you zero wasters. I'm going to talk about this guidance document that our team produced as a follow-on to provide more detail and tools for implementation of the zero waste policy that was approved in 2019. The guidance covers all right, next slide, please. Could you advance? The guidance covers those 5 topic areas that are shown, but I'm going to focus on the second and third of those. Okay, so move on. Next slide. So I have to spend a little time on this landfill slide because some of the relevant concerns are only covered in the landfill section because their treatment would be very similar, and in particular topics like location, sizing, and financial assurance. And so we go into detail there. And if you're working on incinerators, you would want to look back in landfill section to find some information about how to address them. The next slide, please. Next, Janet. So the concern for proper sizing points to one of the basic arguments against incinerators, because a landfill which has a lifetime capacity, unlike a landfill which has a lifetime capacity, an incinerator has a daily capacity. And I guess Kevin covered this. The economics require that capacity be met somehow. This causes diversion of material to the incinerator. It could be managed better otherwise. A primary example is the burning of organics that should be composted. And another possible result of an oversized capacity is to import waste from another jurisdiction, and then I've seen both of these occurrences with past experiences with incinerators. Returning to the set of reasons for imposing incineration besides sizing, there's the fact that energy produced will be less than would be saved by the management of higher in the hierarchy. So it's actually not, we say it's not waste to energy, it's wasted energy, because you would gain more by managing it otherwise. And so then there's the inevitable emissions in air and as toxic ash, needing an enhanced disposal facility. And finally, the loss of material that would have a better use than as fuel. So the guidance emphasizes that the definition of incinerators found in the policy, which is found in our zero waste policy, is temperature-based, which was done to provide a hedge against the industry's practice, ever-changing process, new processes that are, really basically mostly a label change. And so we note in the guidance also that opposition to incineration means we oppose its inclusion as renewables in energy plans, or being counted as toward recycling in a solid waste plan, or as a benefit in a climate action plan. The last slide, please. So chemical recycling our approach was similar to that of incineration, in that we characterized it as one of many technologies that operate at a high temperature and or high pressure, and involves the toxic chemicals in the process. A quote chemical recycling plant being planned in Houston, it turns out to be a basic pyrolysis plant. That was covered up in the announcements. Recycling, when they talk about chemical recycling, that word implies that a material stream that could replace a raw material should be a process output. But research has shown that a high percentage of the output from these facilities will end up as fuel. Even if that was not the intent, if the output is of low quality, which it often is, that would wind up still being burned as fuel. Then there is the strong possibility that such burning would occur in a facility with weak or no pollution control. In summary, an activist could benefit by becoming familiar with the zero waste policy and this guidance. They point to broad strategies such as a close review of the regulatory environment, both at the federal and state levels. And while the policy mentions a few elements of a treatment of environmental justice, a campaign to stop incinerator should always contain a strong EJ component from outside resources. And so that's what I have. Thank you. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Roger. I'll stop the share here. Okay, and this destructive disposal document kind of gives a shorter explanation of what our position is, especially since a lot of our opposition tries to obfuscate and create myths and obfuscate the facts. Our destructive disposal guidance lays out Sierra Club's position, which is important when you're working in kind of jointly with other organizations that don't have these definitive guidelines. So it's a frame of reference, and we think it's important that Sierra Club activists understand it. Thank you, Roger. We're ready for our next round of Q&A. And Martha, do you have more questions from the chat?
Yes, I do. That we have some more questions on incineration and other kinds of recycling. Someone asked, which airborne toxins go unmonitored? I think that's for Kevin.
Heavy metals.
Yeah, happy to answer that one. A lot of them, frankly, most of them. Especially when we're talking about PFAS chemicals. PFAS being per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, of which I'm sure many, if not all of you are aware, are hugely harmful chemicals that it seems every week we find out more and more how present these toxics are in our communities, in our water, and in our lives. There are thousands of PFAS compounds, and they are not monitored in emissions from incinerators. And it is becoming increasingly clear, particularly given the presence of PFAS compounds in our waste, again, things like plastics and packaging, and the rest of what's burned in incinerators. That these compounds are coming out of the stacks. PFAS compounds were designed in part to resist being broken down, even when exposed to very high temperatures. And what limited studies have been done, largely by testing in communities nearby incineration facilities, especially those that are burning toxic waste or burning firefighting foam and other things that contain PFAS and intent to destroy them, shows that they are not, in fact, destroying PFAS compounds, and instead are just sending them up in the air in their emissions and concentrating them in landfill ash. So that's probably the biggest kind of category of toxics that there's basically no monitoring for at this point. And frankly, there's very limited that we see planned at the federal state level to require that type of monitoring. It's a big problem.
Okay, we have another question here that I don't really understand. What is your view of fluid bed dryers? And what is a fluid bed dryer?
I'm gonna admit that I am not up on fluid bed dryers at all, and I do not have a great understanding of what they are. So, yeah, I don't.
Do you know?
You know, I don't.
Maybe not. Okay. Someone wants to know what.
I've never heard of it.
Never heard of it? Okay. Fluid bed dryers are just a form of incineration, according to Gary Liss.
Yeah.
Investigate.
This is, that again, I don't know much about fluid bed dryers. I'm seeing now a comment from Rick that it's a type of high heat disposal that recycles the heat and emissions to keep the system running. I mean, this gets into this gets into that ultimate kind of false narratives drive false solutions problem. If we feel like we're stuck with waste, then hey, let's just come up with a new technology that's going to be better than incineration, in quotation marks, but still involves exposing waste to heat. That's always going to be toxic, and it's always going to be climate damaging. So whatever the next latest thing is that they come up with, in the next years, fluid bed dryers, advanced recycling, gasification, pyrolysis, plasma arc. I've now seen the phrase molecular recycling thrown around to describe pyrolysis. You burn in trash, and if you burn in trash, it's toxic and climate damaging.
There are a couple questions here about more kinds of recycling. Where can we learn more about textile recycling, and how can we dispose safely of all types of batteries?
There are a couple of resources that we've been leaning on for textile recycling that I don't have at my fingertips kind of right now to copy and paste in the chat. But I would I'd be happy to provide to folks either in response to this question or who want to reach out via email. I should say the same goes for any other questions or things that we don't get to. I forgot to mention this at the end, but like my email address is in the presentation that Janet will distribute. It'll be in the recording. Please reach out with any, additional questions or things that we don't get to, or that I don't have the resources at my fingertips right now for. Battery recycling. A lot of that depends on local and state programs. Different states, different cities have different types of programs. Some don't have programs at all, but those that do, in terms of which types of batteries they collect or you can drop off in certain locations, I would encourage folks to kind of check with their local governments about what programs are available in their state or in their towns or cities.
Here's a question that just popped up. Could you explain how much of the pollutants are captured with the scrubbers that some incinerators use, and do the scrubbers then have to be cleaned periodically?
I can do my best.
Take particulates.
Despite how they're often characterized by the waste industry, scrubbers, in quotation marks, other air pollution control measures, they're not 100% effective in the sense that they eliminate all air pollutants from going up the stacks and into the atmosphere. That's just not the case. Different technologies are more effective than others. As I mentioned during my presentation, though, what that principally means is that they are capturing these pollutants in some form of ash that's then combined and has to be landfilled. Again, they're not eliminating the pollutants, they're just putting it somewhere else. The whole toxics in, toxics out truism. It's ending up somewhere. And that pollution, to the question of do they have to be cleaned periodically, all of these types of pollution control equipment need to be regularly maintained to be effective. That again gets back to the point of startups, shutdowns, and maintenance at incineration facilities. They have to have those types of events to maintain a lot of their pollution control equipment, which during shutdown, during startup, during maintenance, it is likely that these facilities are even more polluting than they usually are. Not likely, it is a fact. You can see in emissions data that's reported during startup shutdown, maintenance and malfunction events at particular incinerators that they blow way above their normal emissions limits that again don't apply during those types of events.
Could you comment? I mean, these are some questions now about how can we do better in changing things. Would you comment on the plastic industry's nationwide push for state laws to classify plastic advanced recycling as a manufacturing process to avoid stricter controls on waste facility siting?
Yeah, that's a big part of what we covered in our advanced recycling report, which is linked in the slides. And I'd be happy to discuss further in depth with folks, but quickly in response, a large part of the strategy by the petrochemical industry and the waste industry to push so-called advanced recycling across the country is to reclassify these types of facilities, these types of processes from waste and recycling to manufacturing. They're now up above, I believe, half the states in the country. They've successfully passed laws that say that pyrolysis facilities, gasification facilities, advanced recycling facilities are manufacturing facilities rather than waste and recycling facilities. The reason they do this, the industry, the lobbyists behind this push for advanced recycling, the reason that they do this is because manufacturing facilities in every state across the country are subject to much lower permitting, public notice, public input, and other safety thresholds than waste and recycling facilities are. So in many states, if you want to build a new incinerator or you want to build a new recycling facility, you've got to provide the public notice in advance of what you're trying to build. There'll be an opportunity for the public to come in and potentially oppose the facility during a comment period and during hearings. Many of these facilities need to have emergency plans and closure plans and financial assurances upon closure. In most states, manufacturing facilities are not subject to any of those requirements. And so the industry is trying to reclassify this dangerous type of facility as manufacturing because it makes it cheaper and easier to build these things. And they aren't subject to the same type of reporting, the admittedly low threshold of reporting that incinerators and recycling facilities have to go through, which makes it easier for them to more or less hide the truth of what happens at advanced recycling facilities. What are the outputs? What happens to those outputs? Are the hydrocarbons and toxic chemicals burned? Are they shipped somewhere else to burn? If these things are classified as manufacturing, they don't have to report any of that stuff. And so they can go on peddling this myth that advanced recycling is somehow going to fix our plastic problem, and so that we don't need to move away from plastics. So they get their myth, they get to keep on pumping out plastic, and making everyone feel like they cracked the nut and they have the solution. And they push these facilities and environmental justice communities, having just deprived those communities of the ability to fight back by eliminating public notice comments and public comment processes through these laws. Yeah, I'll leave it at that for now, but it is a huge problem. Luckily, there are things that can be done to pass the types of laws and protections that continue to keep communities safe despite this type of push.
Despicable, that's what I call it.
Yeah.
Okay, we need science. This is another question, which is always a problem when you're trying to give testimony. We need scientists and scientific data to prevail in public meetings. And so how can all of us activists find people like that to come and help out?
So I absolutely agree with that sentiment. There are a number of scientists working at really good organizations across the country that can come and testify on these topics, including people at organizations like NRDC and Beyond Plastics and so on and so forth. I would be happy to kind of come up with a list of some of the folks that we've worked, some of the scientists that we've worked with in opposing some of these things, who I know are kind of engaged in testifying and so on and so forth, that could be helpful. I feel like, was there another part of that question other than just scientists?
Well, how can they get them to come to the no, it was just scientific data.
Right.
Yeah, the scientific data, that was it.
Okay, yeah, and there are a number of resources on a bunch of these issues that include scientific data, some of which I've cited in some form in my slides, but again, a lot of that stuff I'm happy to provide to folks if they want to reach out.
And
Roger?
there's a list of resources at the end of the document, the guidance document.
Oh,
great. Thank you, Roger.
There was one more question about it was about plastic. Let me find it. I've never heard of this either. Are there opportunities to accelerate biodegradable plastic development and use? And how can universities contribute to this R&D? Biodegradable plastic development. I guess we're saying it doesn't exist now, but the research might lead to something.
So I will In response to this, I'll say that my position and the position of Just Zero with respect to biodegradable plastics is one of skepticism, if not outright opposition. The problem with biodegradable plastics are that it is still plastic. And even if a biodegradable plastic is sourced from something other than petroleum, maybe plant matter is used for the carbon in the plastic, they still necessarily involve the addition of plasticizers, which incorporates toxic chemicals. So biodegradable plastics are just as toxic, sometimes more toxic than traditional petroleum-based products. And the idea of biodegradable plastics falls into that trap that plastics are just a waste problem. And if we just figure out what to do with them at the end of their life, we'll have it figured out. When a biodegradable plastic is still a single-use piece of packaging that took energy and resources to create, that's only going to be used once, and potentially has a large toxic footprint as it moves through folks' lives and then landfills, incinerators, et cetera.
Okay, thanks. I'm getting it. I'm getting a message. My battery's running low.
Well, I think we're about to the end of the Q&A. And I do have one further slide to share. It's kind of like a next steps. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank our speakers. I'd like to thank all of our attendees and also those who provided administrative support to our Zoom. There's really a lot to administrative support too. But anyway, it's been really helpful to help us maybe get to the next level of understanding about the plastics problem and the myths and what we need to do to avoid plastics at the front end of the process. But I'm going to share. Oh, wrong one. Oh, here it is. Yes. This slide.
Click on a slideshow on the top there.
Oh, slideshow on the top.
And orange.
Right. Thank you. Okay. What happened here? This is kind of like our next steps. We know that in this limited time, we couldn't have answered all the questions. And as you think about the webinar, and maybe even re-watch the recording when you receive it early next week, you'll probably have questions. And here are some sources of information to help you answer your questions. We have a single-use plastics plus listserv. And so you can raise questions on the listserv and also share information. There's new information coming out every day, but you can share information with other folks on the listserv. And all this information that I'm sharing with you will be part of the follow-up email that you'll get early next week. So don't worry so much about writing down these links. I just want to make you aware of the tools you'll have. Also, we have put some resources. We will be putting resources on the Single-Use Plastics Plus webpage so that there'll be information, studies, that sort of thing. And also, as you find more information and share it with the listserv, we can post more of that information on the webpage so it's available to you and to others. A couple things that are important on the resource list on the webpage is we've come up with some questions to ask at initial public presentations. If you remember at the beginning, I said we wanted to arm you against slick statements made by proponents of incinerators and plastics. So we want to we wanted to give you guys some simple questions to ask with lead-ins and to counter what we think is some of the top questions that will, or the top myths and points that will be made in these slick presentations. Also, in the research, there is a wonderful detailed questions list from Gaia, no-burn.org, but we'll have the link there. And this detailed list is like what you would ask and look at if you are opposing incineration, or you're part of a group that's evaluating how to go forward with a waste disposal process. These questions are really great. And the third thing, although this is just a partial list, is our destructive disposal guidance. And this is the actual document that Roger was talking from and summarizing in his presentation tonight. Now, if you have more questions, reach out to Kevin, Roger, and myself. Within those contacts, you can probably find a lot of good information, especially if you have questions about starting up an initiative or a campaign to oppose incineration. Even incinerators that have been operating for a number of years, there are some things that can be done to help improve them or oppose their continued operation. So anyway, that's the information, some of the information you'll receive next week, along with a link to our recording. So anyway, this concludes our presentation, and we thank everyone for attending.
I think we're ending.
It looks like she's not paying attention.
Well, I think she's shutting down.
Okay, I'm going to end the presentation. The Zoom.
I'm trying to get all these names before they disappear, but now they're gone.
Oh,
All right. Let's see if I can get some more.
I can still hear you. Does that mean there's some functionality still there? Oh,
Well,
and I think about Gary's.
Ended the presentation, not the. Yes, I will save the chat. Okay. I'm just gonna.
Gary,
Well,
Can I show the 3 slides for those who are still on
yes.
that we had agreed on? So I just wanted to highlight other opportunities for people to get more information. One is next week is a webinar on strategies for funding zero waste projects under the US EPA's Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program, which has $4.6 billion available, and materials management programs are eligible but need to be included in priority climate action plans that are due by March 1, and people are working on them right now. You need to get involved if you haven't, to make sure that you have the opportunity to get funding. We also have a variety of classes coming up from Zero Waste USA on Introduction to Zero Waste on February 1st, Zero Waste Associates course on February 29th, Advanced Zero Waste Planning May 2nd, and Zero Waste for Business and Institutions on May 22nd. And the National Recycling Congress that was organized for December last year was postponed to March 5th to 6th. And that's at nrcrecycles.org. You can get more information about over 60 speakers on a whole variety of policies and programs like those that Kevin was highlighting earlier. So hope see you at some of these events. And again, thank you for participating today.
Gary, you can send those slides to me to include on the follow-up email that will go out early next week.
Will do. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you.
So, okay,
That was wonderful. That
Gary,
was
somebody's
wonderful.
Gary, somebody's asking you to put the information in the chat, maybe especially about the webinar that's next week.
Great. Let me get that and I'll put it in the chat.
Are you saving the chat?
I saved it,
Okay, thank you.
but you can just click,
Well, I
click
don't
on
know.
the. So at the bottom of when you go into the chat, there's these little icons at the bottom, and one is a smiley face,
Uh-huh.
add emoji, and then there's 3 dots that says more. If you click on more, it'll at the
Save
very
chat.
top, it'll say save chat.
Oh, and okay, I have it saved, but where did I save it to? I mean, where is it going to go? To my email?
I think it'll show up. No, it'll show up somewhere on your hard drive there.
Ah,
And it's
okay.
good to look immediately for it, but it might be under Zoom. If you have a
Yes.
Zoom directory.
Oh, I don't know if I have that, but that's okay. If you all are going to save it, that's good.
I kept trying to respond to somebody and I couldn't. Oh, what happened when I tried to respond to him and he's no longer in the meeting? Okay.
I guess I could take a look at the chat, the list of the chat comments and see if there's anything we need to respond to, or if there's any frequently asked questions that we might.
I went through and pretty much typed them all in on another piece of paper when they came in, but I think I missed at least one because some guy said, "Did you see my question on such and such?" And I hadn't. That the chat was going pretty fast there at the end. There were a lot of people making comments and not just asking questions.
Mm-hmm.
There were quite a few people who showed up or who did not register, which was interesting.
I'm stopping the recording.
Great.
Okay.
Does the coordination team want to remain online for a minute while we say goodbye to all of our participants?
That would be wonderful.
Just for a quick debrief.
Okay.
Let's say how many participants are left. I guess there aren't any left, huh?
There were
Well,
13.
yeah, we're Jane, Nancy, David, Mike, Kathleen. Thank you so much for coming this evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
I don't think we recorded the first part. Oh, it says it's recording now, right?
It's still recording. And we still have a couple of participants with us.